Joining us now on the line from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Anand Giridharadas. He is a columnist with the New York Times and the author of India Calling, and an occasional guest on this very program. And Anand, it's good to see you again. How are you?
Great to be with you again.
Little jet lag from just coming back from Brazil?
Absolutely. I'm trying to do the brick tour, so but I'm recovering and excited to be back on your show.
Okay, well, we're going to leave Brazil, Russia, and China till next time. Today we're going to talk India and its fight against corruption, which has been called its second independence struggle. Would you agree with that characterization of it?
I think partly for selfish reasons I don't, because in my book I talk about my own theory of what India's second independence struggle is, and for me that is really the struggle of the individual to assert him or herself against the forces of caste, class, tradition, and I think that is a much more, in a way, important and foundational drama that's taking place. But there's no question that the last 20 years of extraordinary growth and optimism and possibility in India will come to nothing if corruption continues to gum up the system, continues to get worse, continues to kind of climb up the price tag ladder, and if the Anna Hazare movement is one attempt to address that, but this is absolutely front and center to making India realize any of its kind of great power ambitions.
Anna Hazare, of course, the guy who said that he saw this as India's second independence struggle. But having said that, give us a sense of how pervasive corruption is in the daily lives of Indians.
It's almost easier to identify the one or two areas of life where it does not reach. It touches everything. It begins at the very bottom in the small daily humdrum tasks of life, getting a ration card for a poor person, getting a bus pass, getting, being pulled over by a policeman because you don't have your motorcycle helmet on, and the policeman being more interested in taking a 50 rupee or 100 rupee, $1 or $2 bribe than actually writing a ticket. And it goes all the way up to $400 million bribes for licenses in the telecoms industry or various other things, and government ministers who make a few $1,000s a year in official salary but have multi-million-dollar homes in Thailand and private jets to take them there with no clear explanation about how they got those resources. And what has happened in a way is the first kind of corruption I described, the small ticket corruption, has been there for a long time and is terrible. The big ticket corruption is interesting because there's so much money now swishing around that it's getting worse, because they know that there's, business people are making billions from the new India, and it's a relatively small price to pay to enrich government leaders who allow them to make their billions.
Here's how you wrote about it in the New York Times a few months ago. I'll read this excerpt and then we'll come back with a question. I have entered India from the sky 5 times over the past year, you write. Those flights started in airports where the norms, rules, and authority carry weight. Hong Kong, Doha, Qatar, Newark, New Jersey, Frankfurt. But in waiting to board, I have come to a troubling realization. Airport workers around the world have learned the hard way that my people, Indians, resident and diasporic, cannot be boarded the way other humans are. No, we will not make a line, no matter how the overwhelmed airline staff plead. No, we will not board according to service class or row number. We will push in as early as we can. No, we will not obey the instruction to bring just one piece of carry-on luggage. We will often pretend not to hear, then perform a Tony-worthy pantomime of surprise if confronted. In Frankfurt recently, I was amazed that even the Teutonic staff of Lufthansa was unable to thwart this behavior. They allowed a kind of mob to form, then dejectedly welcomed its members aboard. I asked about it. A steward shrugged and said that on flights to India, they give in. What does this anecdote tell us about corruption in India, Anand?
If you go back to the man with whom you began, Anna Hazare, who's leading this present movement against corruption, he and the people around him tend to frame the corruption problem in India as an us versus them problem, as a problem of virtuous Indians led by a small number of fabulously corrupt people at the top. And while there is no question that there are fabulously corrupt people at the top, What I was trying to suggest in the column is that I don't think corruption in India is an us versus them problem, somewhat tragically. I think it's something that has seeped so deep into the culture that no one is not part of it. And the observation in the airport is similar to the observation I've made on the streets of Bombay and Delhi, which is that no one pulls over for ambulances. So when an ambulance is coming by and someone is probably dying of a heart attack or something else in that ambulance, people are more interested in getting to where they need to get, and they won't pull over. And people, people who study ambulance and healthcare in India will tell you a lot of people die because people won't pull over. And those are examples for me of a culture in which no one respects the commons, no one respects the civic sphere. People give all their love and giving in the private sphere, within the family, to their close friends. And in a way, there's a question to be asked about, is everyone to some extent tainted by this culture of corruption?
Do you have any idea why that, private generosity, which you see all the time, for some reason doesn't extend into the public sphere?
I think there's a variety of reasons, and one is cultural to a certain extent. This is a culture that traditionally placed a lot of emphasis on doing within your family. So to flip it around for a second, an Indian would not understand why an American would give $10,000 to UNICEF, but let their parents, wither alone in a nursing home in their final years. This is a kind of generosity that an Indian would find not very generous at all. So it's partly a culture in which there is plentiful, abundant giving, but it is giving to those you know, to those in your fold. I think it's also, there's a non-cultural explanation as well, which is when you see the commons in a society kind of pillaged for decades, that commons withers and dies. And nobody believes it's a place that belongs to anybody, and they think it's just a place to steal from. I was recently in Nigeria, and it's the same situation in Nigeria, where the public space that connects all of us has become a place to rob. And yet people's homes are lovely and people's private generosity is lovely. And someone in Nigeria told me, and this is equally true of India, that nobody ever steals from their local neighborhood association. People steal from the anonymous civic commons that has kind of died from neglect.
Now, mind you, there is corruption in every country, but one gets the sense that, for example, in the United States, if there's corruption, people know they're not supposed to do it. Is it fair to say that in India, people prefer it that way?
I don't want to paint with a broad brush and say people prefer corruption, but I think people accept, to an extent that is dangerous, that this is just how it is. And a lot of people wrote to me from India after my column saying, "Thank you for saying that. Yes, it is us, it's not them." So people get this, and people are not under any illusions. But I think you have to ask the question, are these politicians who are very corrupt, are they, these corrupt people who manage to get to the top, or are they just corrupt because they're like us and then they happen to get power? And if you look at the ambulance example, the way people behave in any kind of queuing system in India, the response that people have when a policeman prefers a bribe to writing a ticket, people all too often participate in that corruption. It's very hard for someone in government to be corrupt without someone in the private sector helping them out.
Do they see it, though, as a zero-sum game where I can't, there's no way for me to get ahead unless I prevent you from getting ahead? Is that attitude pervasive?
I think that's right. That is, and there may not be wrong in that. I mean, at another level, it's very hard to ask a poor person who is being asked to pay a bribe for his bus pass to valiantly resist it. So I have great empathy for the fact that individuals, particularly the poor in India, cannot unilaterally take this on. I think where this gets interesting is the higher up the income ladder you go. The way I would think about the corruption problem in India is not as a struggle to get rid of 1,000 people or 10,000 people in power. I would think about it as an attempt to treat this the way we treated smoking around the world. Smoking was something that 30 years ago almost everybody thought was fine, whether they did it or not. Within 30 years, it has been turned into kind of this morally revulsive practice that people feel they have to kind of do in shame. And we've totally changed everybody's idea of smoking, even smokers. And we need to have that kind of campaign of moral suasion, which we also saw with the end of slavery, I think, to make people feel disgusted by corruption, to make even the people who do it feel gross when they do it, and to kind of attack it at the level of culture and morality so that people just don't feel like being corrupt.
That did take, though, Anand, a top-down, bottom-up, through all levers of society commitment. You're right, over 30 years to get to the point where people saw smoking for what it is.
Absolutely.
Do you think India is interested in that kind of a commitment from bottom-up to top-down for 3 decades?
I don't know if the stamina is there, because that's a tough struggle, but I do think something has happened fundamentally. And the Hazara movement, like the Occupy movement in this country, like the Tea Party movement in the US, is not about, it's not just about, is this movement the perfect movement that has all the answers? It's an expression of concern, of deep angst about what kind of country are we becoming. And actually there's too little of that kind of concern. There has been until now. So I actually think it's in a way the first major movement that is saying just celebrating our own growth, just celebrating our own arrival as an emerging power is not adequate. We need to think about what kind of country we want to be as a power. I think that needs to happen in the sphere of foreign policy, of education, of every realm of life. But this is actually in that way quite exciting, because it is one of these emerging BRIC countries saying growth is not enough. What do we want to do? Who do we want to be once we've grown?
This is a little bit of a smart-ass question, so humor me for a second here, but you and I have talked on this program in the past about the dual nature of your citizenship and your identity. You know, you are Indian, you are American. Is the American in you embarrassed by what you see on this file as it relates to India?
You know, I wouldn't say embarrassed, because I've seen this since I was a child, and I understand it too. I'm not, you know, I don't stand in judgment. To be very honest with you, in 6 years of living in India, from 2003 to 2009, through the time I worked on the book, I felt myself changing. I felt myself more willing to kind of push to get my way. And you know, recently someone wrote a piece in the New York Times about how that had happened to him as well, and he decided to leave India for that reason, because he didn't like how it changed him within. And I think that happens to a lot of us who go live there. So I have empathy for the fact that there's something in the air and there's something in the incentive structures that makes ordinary people do things that they may not ideally do. But I think India has such extraordinary promise, such brilliant people, and so much that it can give, not just itself, but frankly the world. And all of that will be obstructed in the end if corruption endures, because at its heart, corruption is a kind of very cruel tax, which basically puts the wrong people in the wrong places. It takes the kind of venal and corrupt and unjust and puts them in positions of influence, and it takes well-meaning ordinary people whose merit would earn them those positions and keeps them out. And India just can't afford that.
Well, you know, I'm going to ask this follow-up. Did you ever bribe anybody?
I did. My first bribe was on the back. I was sitting on the back of an elephant in a tiger park. We went on a tiger safari, and it was 6 days, and I think we just didn't see a tiger. And it was quite disappointing to go on a tiger safari and not see a tiger. So what they do when you're quite far into the safari and you're quite desperate, they put you on an elephant, and elephants have this relationship with tigers where tigers don't run away. So an elephant can just kind of go, and for some crazy reason the tigers don't run away. And you can go right up to the tiger. So the elephant took us up to the tiger, and then we got a 10-second peek at the tiger, and then we left. And I thought, that's not enough. So I took out a little bit of cash, and I bribed the mahout on top of the elephant, and we got a few more tours.
Now, on the continuum of bribes, you know, that's probably a -10. No one's going to get too excited about that, are they?
You know, I mean, that was I guess he was a kind of public official of some kind, but it wasn't. I mean, of course, it's slightly tongue-in-cheek. You know, obviously the issue is not important for you know, people like me trying to see an extra tiger, although that may not be right either. It's really that people who are trying to get access to vital things for their survival. I mean, people trying to get old people trying to get access to their pensions
Sure.
have to do this. And what's really tragic is when people, you know, an executive at a fairly corrupt Indian company once told me, you know, there's two kinds of bribes. There's bribes to get things you're not entitled to and make yourself entitled to them, and there's bribes simply to get things you're actually entitled to anyway. And what's really sad is people in India at the lower levels who are not paying bribes to get things they're not entitled to, who are paying bribes to get things that they're legally entitled to, like their own pensions.
Anand, in our last 30 seconds here, how difficult, or easy for that matter, is it for you to imagine an India without corruption?
You know, it's hard for me to imagine it in the short run, and it is easier for me to imagine it in the long run, because if you look at what else has changed in India in the last generation between, for me, the 1970s when my parents left India, and the 2000s when I moved to India to rediscover their country, so much changed in the realm of caste and class and tradition, allowing the individual who had been reined in so many ways to flower. And that happened actually in a blink of history, if you think about it. And if that can happen so quickly, relatively speaking, I think this is not something that Indians can't do, but misdiagnosis is dangerous. You have to understand that this is a problem deep in the gut in order to expunge it.
Anand, we always appreciate the time you spend with us here on TVO. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Steve.